Okay, can I draw your attention now to the second speaker of the evening? This man deserves your silence. Randolph Kent has been helping the START Network and helping me personally for a long time in trying to provide the environments for collaboration and change. But you should also know that he was the world's first humanitarian coordinator and has been deeply involved in many of the innovative mechanisms of the humanitarian system over the years. So we are extraordinarily lucky to have Randolph Kent as our honorary president. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, John. Can you hear me back there? Yes. If I may, just a kind of preliminary. First of all, a few of you very kindly said before I came down, good luck. So I'm not terribly sure what you're expecting. The other thing is, you know, the difference between an academic and a politician is that Damien gave an outstanding presentation without notes. An academic clutches them. So basically, let me at least, in the few minutes I have, mention a couple of things that I think bring so much of what START is trying to do together. But for those of you who know a bit about me, let me start off with a promise. I promise not to talk about tactile communications. I promise not to talk about telemedicine. I promise not to talk about cyber failure. And here I deeply promise that I will not, in the few minutes I have left, talk about outer space. But I will say that all those things will actually determine your world and how you will operate in it. But now let me quickly move away and say the 3 points that I would like to mention to you has to do with the motivation. And I'd like to talk to you a bit about that. I'd also like to talk to you about innovation. And very briefly, can I also mention something about an organization? You know, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, the World Food Program had a really outstanding workshop in Johannesburg with the SADC countries. And it was fascinating on so many levels. The SADC ministers complained that while so much money was provided to, if you like, on-the-ground institutions, no one looked at ministries of planning amongst the SADC countries to actually try and add to their capacity. So what the World Food Program said is, fine, what we're going to do is organize a workshop in which we can begin to help you get the capacity that you need as ministries of planning. And it was an amazing workshop. First of all, they picked a peculiar subject, pandemics. Why would one pick pandemic? And then they had an extraordinary audience, private sector, some NGOs, some UN agencies. But the ones that really struck me most were the people who were giving the main presentations for the workshop. And that was something called the United States African Command. It was the US military's command in Africa. And I was really flummoxed. And towards the end of the meeting, I said, you know, please, let me ask you, what is US AFRICOM doing here? And they said, sir, not comrade, sir, that you have to understand that a pandemic in Africa is a major security risk to the United States. And the reason I mention that, as you talk more and more globally and more about the intense interconnectedness of our world, one of the things I just wonder, and I heard it come out a bit in this last session today, is we all believe in principles, yes, but there's something that actually underlies humanity even perhaps more, and that is a sense of mutual self-interest. Why I need you, why I depend upon you, and why you need me. And I just wonder, as we look to the future, maybe mutual self-interest, that perhaps overly practical, but I think nevertheless extremely important of humanity, might be a motivating force in the kind of world that we'll see. You know, there was another time as well when we had, and Sean was such an extraordinary leader of this as well, what we call Futures Roundtables. And there we had experts from various sciences and social sciences come together, and we had the various business community as well. And one of them was the founder of something called the ARC, which I'm sure you know, is this African risk capacity. It's an insurance capacity. And I remember someone came up, a very fine person from ICVA, and she said, you know, Randolph, if this kind of drought insurance keeps up, we're out of business. And then just a few weeks later, I was at the meeting of a very large NGO here in the United Kingdom, and they were talking about the configuration of the internet and how the kind of social networkings will get assistance to people perhaps even well before the kind of conventional methods we have. And the reason I mention that is merely for this. We, unfortunately, I believe, are in a sector that looks at innovation in terms of problem solving. And that's not what innovation is about. Innovation is an exploration. What might be out there? Not necessarily to deal with our problems, but that could change the actual context, society, environment in which we all operate. And how might that relate? So DARPA, the Defense Research Agency in the United States, began to undertake technologies that ultimately led to the internet. But this was for a security reason. This only stumbled into other things which now many of us use through mobile technologies to provide cash. So my point really here is, if you use innovation as a problem solver, you miss the extraordinary opportunities that are out there. Wander around to MIT, wander around to the whole Indian technology world. But don't do this to find solutions. Do this to understand what might be out there that is transformational. And then finally, and I think this is an appropriate way to end, I was giving a talk a while ago on the anticipatory organization. Organizations need to think more in the longer term. They have to be more adaptive. And I was going on and on about this, and I began to look at the chairman of the session, and he was sort of beginning to drum his fingers on the table. And I knew either I was running out of time or I was saying the wrong thing. And finally, he turned at the end of my talk and said, you know, Randolph, we have a whole department that deals with policy. So they're the people who deal with our anticipatory strategic thinking. To which I said, that's really interesting. But do the cleaners know? And then he really lost it. He said, you know, why do the cleaners have to know? And I said, because organizations have to have an ethos. If you silo what you expect your organization to do, you will lose the momentum of what you could have. So the anticipatory organization, a bit like organizations in Silicon Valley, with those whiteboards, accept any idea that they feel that you feel might be of interest. They challenge you to think differently. You as perhaps the leader, you as involved in the strategy of the organization. So what I'm saying here is, when you go back to your organizations, think about who's involved. Think about who you're asking to be innovative. Think about who is engaging and where your ideas come from. And without being silly, be interesting to see how many fundamental ideas about the way you structure, the way you do things, might, quote unquote, come from the cleaners. So having said that, let me now, before people start drumming their fingers against a table, what I'm really trying to say in terms of the future environment, given everything that I think you've covered during the last day, which I think is extraordinary, and if I may just say, Sean and your staff have just been extraordinary in putting all of this together. This is what I want to say, and this is my concluding remarks. Do not ignore the profound importance of mutual self-interest across the globe. Principles are important, but humanity is driven in the first instance by my recognition that you're important to me and that I'm important to you. The second thing I'd like to say is, take a look at innovation as an extraordinary opportunity, not to solve problems, but to see what is out there. And the third thing that I'd like to mention and conclude with is this. Go back to your organization. See where the ideas come from. See the interaction across departments in other people's countries that you're working in and your headquarters. Take a look at that dynamics and see if you really have a more effective way of anticipating the kind of crises that we have to deal with and will have to deal with, and anticipating the ways to mitigate them. And that, if you like, is an anticipatory organization with an ethos of dealing and bringing together the organization as a whole. So on that note, nobody's, if you like, tapped their fingers against a table, and that's why I'm going to leave now. Thank you very much indeed.